Many of you will know Dr. Bill MacDonald, but just for those of you who don't, Bill's a nuclear medicine physician who's head of molecular imaging and therapy service at Fiona Stanley Hospital in Royal Perth. Prior to the opening of Fiona Stanley, he worked at Fremantle with Professor Harvey Turner, who lots of people here will know, and has been involved with radionuclide treatments to patients with NETs in WA since 2002. So since Prof Turner's retirement from the public sector, Dr MacDonald's taken over his role in coordinating PRRT for WA patients and participates in the weekly NET multidisciplinary team here at Fiona Stanley Hospital, and is regularly actively involved in the control NET study in regular contact with fellow NET doctors around the country regarding future research opportunities. And Bill and I were lucky enough to sit beside each other on the plane on the way to eNETs in Barcelona just last month, so he might even give us some international updates as well. So thank you so much, Bill, for joining us. We really do appreciate you giving your own time and,
Sure.
and coming to share your knowledge. I will get out of your way and get you a drink and we'll get started.
Okay. So I'm always accused of mumbling, so if people find that they're not hearing what I'm saying, just put your hand up and I'll try and speak more clearly. And I wanted to go through some of the developments that I had seen at the recent conference of the European Neuroendocrine Tumour Society, which is probably the leading conference in the world to this time anyway, on neuroendocrine tumours, and it's held every year, every March in Barcelona. Because all of the Europeans at the end of their winter like to go somewhere a bit sunnier, and Barcelona is an attractive venue for them. And there are quite a few Australians who go to this meeting, about probably a couple of dozen each year, and it's one of the places where you can get the latest updates on what's happening in the NET space around the world. And when I went to the meeting, I attended a very interesting session, which I'll get onto in a minute, but I just wanted to go through a couple of definitions. So for those people who are relatively new to the neuroendocrine tumour language, it can sometimes get confusing. And a key thing to do with neuroendocrine tumours is a thing called the somatostatin receptor. So somatostatin is a hormone, and somatostatin receptors are present on all of our cells, but they're particularly rich on neuroendocrine tumour cells. And somatostatin is a kind of peptide. It's a small protein-like molecule, and so the somatostatin receptor is one to which peptides or little proteins can attach. But they have to have a particular shape in order to get onto the somatostatin receptor. And what I do is a thing called peptide receptor radiotherapy. Now, it has lots of other names, but this is now emerging as the key name that everyone around the world is using. And PRRT is its abbreviation, which stands, as you can see, for peptide receptor radiotherapy. And what that means is that we're getting radioactive molecules which attach to these little somatostatin receptors on the cells and deliver a radiation dose to those cells. And there are lots of forms of peptide receptor radiotherapy. The one in most common use here in WA at the moment is Lutetium-177 octreotide. Lutetia was the old Roman name for Paris, and the molecule lutetium was discovered in Paris, and that's why it's got that name. And octreotide is a kind of peptide. And so octreotide binds to the somatostatin receptor, and the Lutetium-177, which is the radioactive part of that molecule, irradiates the tumour cell. Now, it's a bit of a mouthful, Lutetium-177 octreotide, and so it's got other names which are in use. Lutetium-177 dotatate is, from a chemist's perspective, a slightly more accurate name, but also a bit of a mouthful. So we tend to call it lutate, and that's a name that you might hear bandied around. And then there's a company in the Northern Hemisphere which has developed the commercial rights to this molecule, and which is marketing it in Europe and North America under the brand name of Lutathera. So that's something that you might see on websites or increasingly spoken about in the literature. But there's also Lutetium-177 octreotide, same radioactive molecule, slightly different peptide. It does more or less the same job as octreotide, and it also has some other names which are in use other than Lutetium-177 octreotide, and we haven't yet got a nickname for this one, but I'm sure we will. And then an older molecule, which is now less commonly used, but which was the first one that we researched at Fremantle Hospital 16 years ago now, is yttrium-90 octreotide. That's a much more intense form of radiation and it has more side effects, but may also in some patients be more effective. And its use hasn't gone away in the world, and some people are now looking at using combinations of these molecules in people with different kinds of NETs. So it's important that you understand these terms, or else you get lost very quickly in what people are talking about. And David's been through this business about NET classification, and the World Health Organization Index relies pretty heavily on a thing called Ki-67. Now, Ki-67 is something that pathologists look at under the microscope when a sample of your tumour is given to them. And it's a measure of how quickly cells are dividing. And if the cells are dividing very quickly, that means the tumour can be assumed to be growing quickly. And so that's a marker of an aggressive tumour. Whereas a tumour that's not dividing very quickly is therefore growing only slowly, and that's a less aggressive tumour which is going to do less harm over a longer period of time. And according to the Ki-67 index and some other aspects that the pathologists look at, you can divide NETs into basically 4 different categories, and these have different implications for the kind of treatment that might be recommended. So most of the people in this room and most of the people who are diagnosed with NETs have grade 1 or grade 2 NETs, which are relatively slower growing and well differentiated tumours. That means that the cells, when the pathologists look at them, look like sort of nice, clean behind the ears cells. Other NET tumours are more aggressive, and if they still look sort of nice under the microscope, then we still call them a well differentiated neuroendocrine tumour. And then there are the much less common, fortunately, high-grade neuroendocrine cancers, which are poorly differentiated, and they get a different kind of treatment. So it's important that you understand the terminology, and it's also important that you understand that there are different grades of these tumours. Now, when I was at the ENETS conference, there was a very interesting session put on by a body called the International Neuroendocrine Cancer Alliance. And Simone Layden, who's the president of the Unicorn Foundation, in fact, is the current president of this body. And there should be more of this at medical conferences, but there isn't so far. But this was interesting because this session concentrated on what do patients want from us as healthcare providers and from the research bodies around the world. And this fellow here that you can see in the slide is the president of the Belgian NETS Foundation. He himself is a NETS patient who's had the condition for 15 years, and he spoke very well about patient needs. And there were some things that emerged from this session that I found very interesting. So the first thing that came out was that you all have this sort of incredible thirst for information, because it's been perceived that there is a lack of information about these tumours, and I think that that's a fair criticism. They're not that common. Many doctors aren't very well educated about them. The information that is available is too complex and it's not presented in plain language. And there's a lack of information about the various treatment options that might be available, and in defence of us, they do vary somewhat around the world, what treatments are available to people. And there's also a lack of information about patient and family support, which I think bodies like the Unicorn Foundation are helping to address. People also wanted information about access to PRRT, so that's the peptide receptor radiotherapy, the lutate therapy, and in particular its availability, because it's not available everywhere. And when it is available, it's not necessarily affordable. So I think in Western Australia we're fairly lucky that most patients who need this treatment can get it, and they can get it at minimal cost. People also wanted access to research trials, and this was quite a big theme in what patients had said that they wanted. They wanted access to the most cutting-edge treatments, and when new treatments came along, they wanted to be at the front of the queue for those. And they also wanted to see in these research trials an increased emphasis or collaboration between patients and researchers about the sorts of things that we're measuring in research trials. So We might think it's important to know who's going to live the longest, and you're obviously interested in that, but you might also be interested in how much it affects the quantity of diarrhoea that you have, which we have focused on a little bit less in some of the studies to date. And then finally, people wanted access to treatment in a centre of excellence, and I'll get back to what defines a centre of excellence a little bit later, but they were the sort of things that leapt out at me about what your perceived needs are, and these are things that we should be paying attention to in how we plan our treatments into the future. Now, given that you all wanted to know a bit about research, I thought it was useful just to spend a couple of minutes going through the research pathway, because it's important, if you are involved in research, that you understand how this whole process works, and that some of the frustrating delays that you might notice have sometimes a logical explanation. So when a new drug is developed, we have 3 important phases of research and then a 4th phase to follow. And the first phase is, if you've got a new drug and you give it to people, what happens? Does it kill them? I mean, there are examples, unfortunately relatively rare, of drugs which have been given to healthy volunteers which have killed them. And that's obviously not a very good treatment. If it doesn't kill you, does it make you sick? And how much of the drug can you give to people before it makes them sick? And so from this phase 1 research, we typically work out a thing called the maximum tolerated dose, which is the maximum amount of a drug that we can give you without making you too sick as a result. When we have that maximum tolerated dose and we're satisfied that it doesn't kill you, we move on to phase 2 research, which is to give it to a larger number of people with the condition to see if it actually works. So we know it doesn't kill you, we know we can give you X amount. Does giving you X amount actually achieve anything? And if it does, how much does it achieve, and how long does that benefit last for, and is it worthwhile? And this is called phase 2 research, and a lot of what we have been doing in NETS treatment so far is phase 2 research. There are now a number of treatments we know we can give you, and we know kind of what they're likely to do, but what we don't know is which treatment we should recommend to you. And this is what is covered in phase 3 research, which is how does it compare with other treatments, in particular the existing standard treatments that might be available. So we have a number of existing standard treatments at various phases of NETS disease. And in the case of my field, PRRT, radiation treatment, how does this PRRT compare to patients who might be getting octreotide? Is it better, the same, worse? Should we add it to octreotide or replace octreotide with it? And the same with the other treatments that some of you might be taking, although these are prescribed less often in people with NETs. And then after that phase 3 research has been done, and by the way, all of that's going to take some years before we have those answers, and that's assuming that the research is conducted well and people enthusiastically volunteer to be participants in it. Then whoever is developing these treatments can go to the regulatory authorities, and in Australia there's a thing called the Therapeutic Goods Administration, and they can say, well, we've got this treatment, we think it's pretty good, we'd like to start using it in people, and they need permission from the government, the regulators, your safeguards, to do that. And once they've got permission to use it in people, they then need to get someone to pay for it. And that might be you, the patients, or it might be Medicare, or it might be the state hospital system, but someone needs to pay for approved treatments before they become part of routine care. And then once they become part of routine care, we have a 4th phase of research as well. Did it all meet our expectations? You know, when we do use it commonly in people, does it perform as well as we had hoped? Or is it more disappointing than we had hoped? And do any long-term issues emerge? So we didn't find any problems after using it in people for a year, but having used it for 10 years, have we found some problems? And a good example of phase 4 research which uncovered problems would be thalidomide. So thalidomide was used in pregnant women with morning sickness, and it was very good at controlling their morning sickness. Unfortunately, it gave a lot of babies birth defects, and that didn't really emerge until the babies had been born, and even then it took a few years for the penny to drop. So post-marketing surveillance and phase 4 research is an important part of the deal. And all the while that this is going on, new drugs are going through earlier phases of the research, and so it's this great big soup of stuff and that gets discussed at conferences. And one of the things that you will need to be able to get your head around if you're interested in cancer research is this thing called Kaplan-Meier survival analysis. So there on the right hand, or the vertical scale, is the survival probability. How likely are you to be surviving? And I'll get on to what that means in a minute. With everyone starting off at 100%, and then over time, which is on the horizontal axis, people falling away from that 100% survival starting point. But survival can mean a lot of things. It can refer to anything, really. It can refer to survival free of tattoos. It can refer to survival free of disappointment about the football results. It can refer to survival free from death, which is an important outcome in cancer, but also to survival free from progression of disease, so that if a disease is not progressing, it's just sitting there doing nothing much. Or it can refer to survival free from any disease at all, and we call that disease-free survival. So don't be alarmed by the word survival. It's a necessary term to use in this analysis, but it doesn't necessarily mean living or dying. And lots of cancer research is to do now with progression-free survival, which is treatments stopping the cancer in its tracks, hopefully making it better, but preventing it from getting worse. And so that's an important thing for you to understand. Now, when we use these curves, you can see that there are two lines here, and they're separated, and over time they're separating more and more. And the bottom line, the green line, group 2, 50% of the people have shown have not survived beyond about 8 months from starting this treatment. That means that they may have started to progress, they may have developed disease when they didn't have it before, or if it's a nasty cancer we're talking about, they may have died. And in group 1, there's a longer survival period. 50% of the people in group 1 survived for 23 months before they showed a lack of survival. In this case, let's assume a progression of their disease. And so treatment 1, the blue line, is better than treatment 2. And you'll see these graphs all the time in cancer research. They're almost routine, and it's important that you understand what they're showing you. So the wider the separation between the lines, the greater the difference between the treatments, and the flatter the line, the better the treatment. A steep drop is bad, a flat line is good. Now, David was telling you about the incidence of NETs in Australia, and this is data from the United States showing exactly the same thing. So the orange line is the incidence of neuroendocrine tumours, and the blue line is the incidence of all cancers. And you can see that all cancers are actually slightly dropping in the United States now, and that's probably got a lot to do with lifestyle modification, whereas the incidence of NETs is going up a lot. And on the left-hand graph, you can see that the incidence of NETs in the United States is now around about 6.5 people per 100,000 in the population per year, which is exactly what we see in Western Australia. And there are different kinds of NETs, and the increase has been found in the US to be greatest with lung tumours, and that may well have something to do with smoking. So there's a bit of an epidemic of lung cancer going on in Western societies at the moment, which reflects smoking behaviours sort of 10, 15, 20 years ago. But there's also an increase in neuroendocrine tumours involving the small intestine and the large intestine, and pancreatic tumours in the grey there are making a late run at the end. I can use this. So this is pancreatic tumours in the grey, and they're starting to increase recently as well. Now, some of these tumours, like pancreatic tumours, they're not particularly nice tumours. It's not likely that they were always there in days gone by and we just didn't notice them. It's much more likely that these are truly increasing in frequency, whereas some of the other tumours, like for example in the rectum, it's quite conceivable that we're finding those because of improved detection and there were always lots of them which we didn't know about. And this would be backed up by this graph here, which shows that the greatest increase is in these relatively low-grade nets, whereas higher grade nets, these nastier sort of grade 3 and grade 4 tumours, have been increasing more slowly, but they're still increasing. And these nasty nets would not have escaped detection in years gone by. And this is a graph which presents, some of you have seen this already, and I got a bit flummoxed about this last time I was speaking to some of you, but this is the number of people who have been diagnosed with nets in the United States in the 20 years prior to this study being done. You can see that the number of people living with nets has been going up, and it's now about 1 in 2,000 people in the United States, which means that there would be about 1,250 people in Western Australia who either have or have had nets in the last 20 years. At the eNets conference, David Wild, who's an oncologist at the Royal Brisbane Hospital, presented some data from Australia and New Zealand, and as you've seen, the incidence of nets is increasing, but mortality is not, at least in Queensland. And survival is improving over time, as we've seen from the WA data. It does vary according to the organ of origin and the age at which you get nets, and the older you are, I'm sorry, most things are worse when you're older, and this is one of them as well, the worse you do. And many patients with nets get their disease in middle age, so perhaps that's a good thing. And interestingly, in the limited amount of data that there is available from Asian countries, the incidence of nets appears to be significantly lower in Asian countries than it does in countries which have large Caucasian populations. We don't know why. And they seem to have a higher rate of rectal tumours, which have a better prognosis compared to countries dominated by Caucasian populations where small bowel, pancreas and lung tumours are more common. And this is data that David presented showing that the incidence of nets in Queensland is going up, whereas the death rate from nets is not over time. And this widening gap is a reflection perhaps of more benign disease at diagnosis, but also better treatment. Now, just going back to this Kaplan-Meier survival analysis, just to remind you, and it can refer to anything at all, a guy called Jonathan Strasberg from Tampa in Florida coordinated a study called the NETA-1 study, looking at how well PRRT, so this radiation treatment, works. And they published this last year in a very prestigious journal called the New England Journal of Medicine. And this was patients in whom octreotide was no longer working. And if octreotide was no longer working, they randomised you to one of two options. One is that they just increased your dose of octreotide, gave you more of it. And the second is that they gave you this PRRT, lutetium dotatate, which is what we use here in WA. And going back to those Kaplan-Meier curves, this is a Kaplan-Meier curve of progression-free survival, so how long it took your tumour to start getting worse. You can see that there's quite a big separation between the group that got an increased dose of octreotide and the group that got the PRRT, which means that the PRRT is a better treatment than increasing doses of octreotide. This is assuming octreotide is no longer working. They didn't get these patients who had had no treatment. And even more impressive, the lutetium dotatate was associated with improved survival, so less people died in the lutetium dotatate group than the group who received increased doses of octreotide. But the regulatory authorities in the United States weren't happy with this, and they said, well, you haven't followed these patients for long enough because it's a slow-growing disease and you've only followed them up for about 2.5 years, so we need more data. And he presented data on what's called the NETA-1 extension study at the eNets conference, and all of the things that they had seen in the publication remained, but even more so. So there was a significant and persisting separation in progression-free survival, so the PRRT was better. And this is a thing called a hazard ratio, which means if the hazard ratio is 0.2, that means that you are 1/5 as likely to show progression at any given point in time if you've had PRRT compared to if you've had increased doses of octreotide. And they also looked at overall survival in the extension study, and they saw the same kind of thing, a durable difference in survival and a hazard ratio in this instance of about 0.5, so you were half as likely to die at any given time if you had PRRT compared to increased doses of octreotide. And they looked at things like quality of life. So this is the global health status as evaluated by the people in the study. And again, the PRRT showed a better quality of life or better overall health status compared to the group that got the increased doses of octreotide. Not surprising if they weren't dying. And that hazard ratio is 0.4, which means that you were 60% more likely to have better health at any given point in time if you'd had the PRRT. But there were less impressive differences in terms of things like fatigue, where there wasn't really much difference between the two groups, and diarrhoea, where there was a small difference between the groups. So that was encouraging for me. A guy from Rotterdam, and Rotterdam was the first centre to use this treatment and has used it more than anyone else in the world, really. They developed Lutetium octreotide in Rotterdam. Possibly in Rockingham, but they kept it quiet if it was Rockingham. They were talking about their patients who need more treatment. And so with this group, they gave 4 cycles up front, which is what we do here in Western Australia. And if patients needed more treatment, and they were happy to offer more treatment if the patients were in reasonable shape, and the initial treatment had achieved some stable disease or better, and the progression-free survival was at least 18 months after their first dose of PRRT. If the patients needed more treatment, they gave them another couple of cycles. And if the same thing occurred, if the patients responded to that repeat treatment, they were happy to do it again down the track if needs be. And of the patients who showed progression following their initial PRRT treatments, when they retreated them, 75% of them showed a benefit. They got a response again to the treatment. And even more impressively, if you'd responded to 2 previous treatments, when they gave you the third lot, 92% got better. And they found that with these repeat PRRT treatments, that there was improved survival compared to people who only got 1 treatment. And therefore, that told me that we should be offering people further treatments, providing the first one has shown some benefit. If the first one didn't work at all, no point in flogging that one again. And furthermore, there was no increase in severe blood or kidney toxicity from these repeat treatments. So we know now that this is a treatment that can work and that we can give again without compromising your safety too much. I don't want to dwell too much on this because it's not yet available, but there is a blood test available which analyses a whole basket of genes in your cancer. And genes in your cancer spill into your bloodstream and they can be measured with a blood test. It's quite a complicated analysis and it's going to be, I would predict, prodigiously expensive. So how much we'll be able to use it, I'm not sure. But out of this blood test, it's possible to get a score or a risk rating. And in initial research in several centres, mainly in Europe, they've shown that this test is better than chromogranin A, which is our current standard blood test treatment. It can distinguish in the lung net cancers from other lung cancers without the need for biopsies. It's able to sort patients into low, intermediate and high risk groups. And it can pick patients who after an operation might still have small amounts of cancer left in their bodies which could benefit from treatments at an early stage rather than waiting for them to get worse. And together with other tests, it also seems to be able to predict who's likely to respond to PRRT treatment, so the radiation treatment that we give. And this is a study which was from groups in Italy and Germany and Holland, where and it's the same sort of curve. Here on the top line is the groups who were predicted by this blood test to be responders to PRRT, and here in the red line is the group who were predicted not to be responders to PRRT. They all got PRRT, and you can see that the group that the blood test suggested wouldn't do as well didn't, and the group that the blood test suggested would do well did pretty well. So this is about 3.5 years later, and about 70% of them haven't had any progression of disease during that time. I'm expecting that in the next little while we'll start to use this sort of technology more and more, but at the moment it's still in very early stages of development, and I'm concerned that it will cost a lot. So at the moment we can't offer it to people, but it's coming. A group from Oslo looked at PRRT in higher grade NETs. So this is a group that previously had been mainly treated with chemotherapy, and they found that it was worthwhile in patients who had higher grade tumours, and quite a few of them had at least stable disease or some response to the treatment, but some didn't. And they were able to get progression-free survival figures which are as good as most chemotherapy regimes. But a number of patients who had, lots of whom had had many previous treatments, got some toxicity out of the treatment. So, whereas previously our PRRT has been mainly focused on these lower grade NETs, this is a treatment which I think we can ethically offer to people with higher grade tumours, particularly if their Ki-67 isn't too off the scale. But it's not a good idea to use it in this group, who they would be unlikely to respond, and chemotherapy remains the mainstay in the neuroendocrine cancers. Lots of research is going on. I don't want to dwell too much on that, but a lot of these questions that I was posing earlier on have now, I think, been relatively satisfactorily answered, and we're moving on to these more unknown areas of research, and so the research trials that we're about to introduce are going to focus more on those. We've done a lot of research at Fremantle Hospital over the last 15 years or so on this. Interestingly, in spite of that, the use of PRRT in Western Australia isn't continuing to go up, and I don't know why that would be. We had a bit of a hiccup when we moved to Fiona Stanley. There was a restricted availability of the treatment, but the treatment's now pretty freely available, and we're not using it as much as we were even a couple of years ago, which suggests to me that people either don't know that it's available, or they're not being recommended the treatment. So research that we're currently in the pipeline or are even doing focuses now on comparisons with other treatments, either with everolimus or Afinitor, comparison with chemotherapy. This is a research program that we're likely to start maybe later this year or early next year. In the patients with neuroendocrine cancers, there's a comparison between different chemotherapy regimes. And this is interesting stuff about somatostatin receptor antagonists, which I don't think I'll dwell on, but we can come back to it during questions if you want. Just finally, ENET Centres of Excellence. So the European Neuroendocrine Tumour Society has a definition for what they regard as a centre of excellence. You have to be a single facility or a group of closely related facilities. You have to see a certain number of patients. You have to pass a training program that they offer by ENETs, and you have to be certified as a centre of excellence by an accreditation agency based in Germany. And they've actually surveyed in Europe what benefits that this might bring to the hospitals that are centres of excellence. First of all, they get more patients being treated in them. They have improved systems within those hospitals for evaluating and treating patients. There's more in-depth discussions about the treatments. There's a bigger span of treatments available, greater expert knowledge, and consistent participation by various specialists. The documentation and patient follow-up programs are better organised and better explained to patients, and they measure their quality performance better. And they also perform more research. And institutions that perform research are better places to be treated. When I get sick, I want to be in an institution that's doing research. But what isn't known is what the benefits to the patients are, and that's something that you can only measure over a long period of time. So that's still in the pipeline. It would be hard to imagine that it would be worse for them. So my conclusions from this conference are that the role of PRRT is growing in the treatment of NETs. It's now, I think, the second line option after octreotide and lanreotide in patients with lower grade NETs, and that's the way we're currently tending to use it here in Western Australia. In higher grade NETs, it would be reasonable, given the results presented from the Norwegian study, to consider this as a first line option, or certainly to use fairly rapidly after chemotherapy if that was the first line option. And we need to continue ongoing research to determine which of these treatments would be preferred, should we recommend. It's one thing to say that there are 4 different treatments available. You guys want to know which is the best, and that's where our research needs to focus. Redo PRRT is feasible and reasonably safe, and the majority of patients show some response to it. The NET test, that blood test I was showing you, shows some promise as an easy diagnostic and predictive test, but there's a lot of work to do before it's routinely available. And I think overall in Perth we're doing pretty well in terms of our patient information with the help of bodies like the Unicorn Foundation. We're doing reasonably well with the availability of PRRT, which was a key desire by patients, so nearly everyone who needs it can get it in Perth in a reasonably quick time frame and they don't pay for it. We have good participation in research trials. Personally, I'd like to see us move towards becoming a certified centre of excellence, but that's a big project. And that's all I've got. Thank you.